Our next guest is Stefanie Tignor, Head of Data Science and Insights at Humu. If you haven't heard of Humu, it's a company that's developed a software program to give managers what Humu describes as evidence-based nudges. These automated reminders and prompts pop up throughout the day and tell managers things they can do to improve morale or boost motivation on their teams. So Stefanie is constantly looking at data to try to figure out what recommendations work best and how to deliver those in a way that gets results. Whether or not you think those nudges would work for you, Stefanie has a lot of great data and intel on what managers can be doing to better support their teams, particularly in hybrid and remote workplaces, and how organizations should think about the changing role of managers in 2022. Stefanie's going to share a short presentation, and then I will join her back on stage here for discussion and to take your questions. Stefanie, welcome to EmTech Next.
Thank you so much. So today I'm going to talk with you about organizational transformation and how these tiny little actions and interventions called nudges can actually drive massive change within organizations. Thank you so much for that great introduction. This slide is just here to tell you that I love data. And specifically, I'm a data scientist with a PhD in social and personality psychology. And so of all of the data, I most love data that can help us understand how people behave, why they behave the way they do, why they feel the emotions that they feel, and maybe even predict human behavior. And so the data that I'm going to show you today is exactly that type of data. So in my role at Humu, I talk to a lot of executives and organizations who are really interested in transforming their organizations. They're really interested in steering the massive ship that is a global organization, a really complex organization with many layers and many functions and many different types of jobs. But unfortunately, doing this is really, really hard. McKinsey estimates that 70% of organizational transformation efforts fail. And so we have these folks who are really interested in implementing strategic changes and shifts within their organizations. And then at the same time, the bulk of them are doomed to failure before they even start. And so we were really interested in this at Humu and interested in how we can actually change this and turn the tide and maybe make organizational transformation efforts more likely to succeed. And so we dug into the data and we talked to people and we did research, and one crucial person kept coming up again and again and again in everything we did. And that is the manager. So when we're thinking about organizational transformation efforts, we found that managers are the most important connection point between company strategy and employee action. And that makes sense, right? Because we have all of these strategic initiatives coming from leaders at the top, and there's all this pressure on managers. And then managers are the ones tasked with actually executing on this strategy and translating it to employees. And so managers are really a make or break point in any strategic initiative or organizational strategy. And by the way, if they fail at this, that's not their fault, right? Oftentimes they are not equipped with the tools to enact this strategy and don't know how to best do it. So we found that a great culture and any transformation effort really starts and ends with your managers. But I just talked about how much I love data, and all I'm doing is telling you that. And so why don't I show you some data that we've collected ourselves across all of our Humu users in really complex data sets combining behavioral data, sentiment data, HR data, retention data, all these different data sources showing the powers of managers and then what actually your managers can do to make an organizational transformation effort successful. So I'll start with some basics. We found in our data that managers are 2 times more influential than leaders or teammates in making an organizational transformation effort succeed. Think about that. They are 2 times more influential in implementing a strategy than the people who came up with the strategy themselves. They also help with resiliency. So managers, when they are top managers, their teams are 20% more resilient to burnout. We also looked at retention data. Obviously, retention is top of mind for a lot of people these days. And we looked at great managers and not so great managers, and then actually followed their team members in that HR data to see how long they stayed at their organizations in the subsequent months. And from actual attrition data, we saw that top managers, their teams were 24% more likely to stay over the subsequent months. So huge implications for ROI and huge implications for the bottom line for organizations. And all of that is really sort of hard metrics about cost and savings and things like that. But we also just wanted to know, what does it feel like to have a great or a not so great manager? And so we surveyed people. And we saw that 95% of people agreed that a bad manager makes everything worse. Horrible, 95%. So clearly, managers are really influential for strategy. They can protect a team against burnout. They can help with the bottom line. And also just if a manager's not doing a great job, it feels really, really awful. And that's very important as well. Okay, so that's a general overview. Managers are really important. But next we wanted to dig into a real world use case, a real world example of an organizational transformation in real time. And unfortunately, we did experience a very large organizational transformation globally around March of 2020, when we had this shift to remote work. And so managers were very unprepared to make this shift, to suddenly manage a remote or hybrid workforce. Layered on top of that, obviously a very stressful and turbulent time that could be very emotionally impactful for people. And so we wanted to see when sort of the rubber hits the road, when there is a real and very stressful organizational transformation in real time, can managers help buffer their employees against the negative effects of this event? So we did a study. We looked across tens of thousands of employees worldwide, and we split them into 3 cohorts. First, we just looked at people who we called our baseline. These are people who were hired between April and June of 2019. So really, tons of time before the pandemic hit at their workforce. I'm not going to talk about this group today because they're sort of our control group. They behave exactly like we expected. Who I do want you to focus on are these bottom 2 groups: the pre-pandemic hires and the post-pandemic hires. So pre-pandemic hires were people who were hired from December to February of 2020. These people had just a couple of months in office and then switched to remote work. We compared them and how they're feeling today with post-pandemic hires. These are people who were hired from April to June of 2020. So they never had in-office interaction. They started right in the midst of this really stressful experience. And here is what we found. So the orange bar are the post-pandemic hires, the gray bar are the pre-pandemic hires. These people started just a few months apart, but you can see that across the board when it comes to happiness and job satisfaction, these post-pandemic hires felt 4 to 6% worse on average. And that can really compound, right? So imagine, most organizations have 5 to 15% of their workforce starting within the pandemic. Some have as many as 30%. So clearly this is a really big impact. And these people started just a few months apart. But I'm not here to tell a sad story. I'm here to tell you how managers can actually buffer employees against these really negative impacts. And so we looked out to see exactly that. And that's exactly what we found. So when we looked at employees whose managers actually regularly took action, tried new things, approached work in new ways, pivoted, were able to adjust in the moment, the pre- and post-pandemic hires were statistically identical. The difference completely went away, and they were feeling 16% happier. And so when managers take action on strategic initiatives and takes action to try new things in the face of organizational turbulence and changes, we can see these effects completely mitigated. So that was really great as well. So we see managers are really important. We also see that they can help buffer employees against negative impacts in really stressful times. But I also wasn't satisfied there because, okay, we know managers taking action is helpful, but what specific actions are the most helpful was what we wanted to know next. Can we really drill down and understand if a manager is going to do just 2 things, what precise 2 things should they do? And then if we know that, we can hopefully design interventions and nudges to reinforce those behaviors. So again, we went to the data worldwide across all our Humu users and looked at when managers are the most effective, what are the key actions that they're taking? And we came upon two things. The most effective managers create structure and process for their team to work better, and they regularly recognize their people. They regularly make them feel recognized and appreciated. We found that these two actions are the most powerful for team productivity, for manager-employee relationships, and also for retention. And what I loved was that this interpersonal dimension, this recognition, is actually a little more important for retention. And so it's really about this interpersonal stuff. Okay, so now we've arrived at sort of a good news, bad news situation. The good news is that we know that managers are really important and they can protect employees against really stressful situations and organizational change and act as really guiding lights when that happens. And we also know the exact behaviors that they should enact to see the greatest level of success. So that's all good news. But the bad news is, how do we actually get them to engage in these behaviors? So now we know this, but we have in a large organization, maybe hundreds, thousands of managers, all in different regions, all with different types of jobs, overseeing different types of employees. And so how do we actually ensure that they're regularly taking action and regularly creating structure and also regularly recognizing their employees? So to do this, we turn to something called nudge theory. And a nudge is a tiny intervention that helps people make better decisions without restricting their freedom of choice. A great example of a nudge is auto-enrollment in 401k programs. So many employers sort of force the employee to set up their 401k, to go through all that paperwork, to figure out what's the best plan for them, to enroll themselves. Whereas some other employers actually set it up for the employee, and the employee is automatically enrolled, and then the employee just has to opt out if they'd like to not participate. And in both of these situations, the employee has the exact same choices, right? They can set up a 401k or they cannot. But in the auto-enroll example, all the work is done ahead of time, and then they just have to opt out. And when researchers compare these two types of 401k plans, they find that there is much more participation when it's opt-out versus opt-in. In fact, it's estimated that opt-out 401k programs have actually saved Americans somewhere around $30 billion from their inception, just from this tiny little nudge. And so when we think about nudges at Humu, we think about how could we use technology to auto-enroll managers in great management? What might it look like if being an amazing manager was actually opt-out instead of opt-in? And so we've built algorithms to do exactly that. And so at Humu, we take data from employee HR systems, from anything that we know about the employee sentiment, from how they're interacting with our content and their behavioral inputs, as well as best practices from data science, from people science, from behavioral science, and create these algorithms to serve up just the right action recommendation at the right time to the right person based on how their team is feeling, what we know about their situation, what they've asked and requested and personalized within the system, so that when a manager, for example, starts their week, and we know that they need to recognize their team members that week, what if instead of having to remember that, that was just automatically delivered to your inbox or Slack or Microsoft Teams or wherever you worked? And not only did it remind you to recognize your team, but it also gave you great advice about how to actually do it most effectively. What if all this was right in front of you? And so again, instead of having to remember and being forced to remember what to do and how to be a great manager, what if it was all just delivered right to you? So from nudges, we've seen really amazing results. So we've seen that when managers get nudges, 82% of them try new approaches to management. And we know that trying new approaches is so important for developing and growing and developing a resilient workforce. We also see that managers who receive nudges are 3 times as likely to build new habits in just 3 months. They are far less likely to view the institution as a barrier to change. So before nudges, they might think this institution doesn't want us to try new things, try new approaches. Afterwards, that goes way down. And we see that nudges help managers perform better in their jobs. So not only are they feeling better, and not only do employees notice the difference, but we also see that when managers get nudges, their own performance ratings go up as well. So really powerful effects of nudges. So in closing, I want to leave you with two thoughts. Number one, I want you to remember, if you remember nothing else from this session, that managers are the executors of your organizational strategy. And I want you to think about, are they prepared? Do they have the right tools? Because we can come up with the best strategy in the world, but if we don't equip the people who are tasked with executing it to execute it well, then it might be doomed to start. Secondly, I want you to think about what it might look like in your organization if you were able to use technology to auto-enroll managers in great management. What might it look like if you actually made being a great manager the easier choice? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stefanie. That was so interesting. I have lots of questions, and of course, we'll have some time from the audience as well to take yours, so please do get those in on the event platform as we go. So, a lot of this maybe seems somewhat obvious. I mean, we've all had good managers, bad managers. We know how that impacted our work or our enjoyment in the workplace. I just want to start by asking, what about this surprised you most about the research that you did? What stood out and what was most surprising to you in thinking about that?
Yeah, I'll say two things. Number one, just the size and the magnitude of the impact of managers. So that stat that they're 2 times more influential than leaders and than teammates, that was really surprising that we saw such a massive effect of managers. I really didn't expect that. And number two, just how unprepared we are to equip managers with the right tools for the job and to help them execute on strategy. Particularly within the pandemic and as we've shifted to hybrid work and remote work, we see that managers more than ever are becoming the face of the organization. And so before the pandemic, maybe a manager was tasked with task management and coaching employees and developing. But now their job has really expanded, and they're also responsible for translating the vision and the mission and the strategy of the organization. Because today, when an employee is not going in the office, they are really representing the organization to that employee. And so given that massive impact and that just weight and importance of that role, it was really surprising also to see just how little there exists to support these managers in that endeavor.
And one of the things that you called out as something that is really impactful when managers do it is create new structure and processes. And I'm wondering, in this kind of hybrid, remote, post-pandemic world, what are some of the structures and processes that people are craving at work? Are there certain ones or specific kinds that you think are extra important?
Yes. I would say more than anything, the communication norms are key here. So if we're shifting the way we communicate, we have to create new processes and new norms for communication. And so that can be things like asynchronous and bursty communication on Slack. So a lot of organizations are not doing this or struggling with this, where instead, if we used to have sort of chance conversations in the office or pull someone aside to talk about something, today we need to translate that to Slack or Teams or whatever tool you use or email. And often we don't see organizations setting up processes and structure for that sort of asynchronous and bursty communication.
And then the other one was recognizing and appreciating employees, which again sounds so obvious. So tell people that, you appreciate them or that they're doing good work. But I feel like where a lot of people fall down there is maybe in the details or the way it's done or the frequency. So what are some of the specific tips you have about how to do that well that managers can take away?
Overall, overwhelmingly, we see frequency is often where managers stumble, particularly with really high performers. Because often we see that managers think, oh, this is my star performer. So they know they're doing an amazing job. And maybe you haven't provided them with any sort of recognition in a month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe a year since their last performance cycle. And so often we see that the frequency is just too low. We also see a common trap is that often managers will recognize employees in a really big group setting and recognize them all together. And sometimes that's really valid and warranted, if the team pulls off an amazing project and we're going to recognize the team as a group. But if you really mean an individual or two individuals who did a particularly outstanding job, really have those one-on-one conversations with people. It's much more effective than just saying, great job, team, everyone did amazing, because that sort of tends to blend in over time, and people don't hear that as one-on-one direct praise and feedback.
Then Lisa from our online audience has a great question, talking about your nudges specifically that you're doing at Humu. So what kinds of resistance do you get in trying to implement those nudges with managers, and how do you overcome that?
Yeah, that's a great question. To be honest, we haven't seen a great deal of resistance. And part of the reason is that we make it using the nudges actually makes your job easier as a manager. And that's really key to this behavioral science component of nudges, right? Is that we don't want to create more work for the manager. Oh, now I have to do this other thing. But rather, I was going to have this team meeting anyway. I have to have this team meeting. It's on my calendar. And so how can I actually make it more effective, better for me personally as a manager? And so we tend not to see a great deal of resistance. Sometimes we do see, it's really important to structure nudges in a way that takes into account sort of the expertise or level of the manager. And so a new manager, we can't start them on a double black diamond, right? New managers, maybe we want to build a great foundation. And so consequently send nudges that maybe start. Whereas with a leader or someone who's really seasoned and experienced, we shouldn't send those same nudges to them. And so I'd say if you're going to encounter resistance, that's sometimes where you have to get it really right, is making sure that you're tailoring them to the correct level of the individual.
And another question from our online audience, Sarah asks, did your study show anything about support from peers versus managers? Does recognition from peers have any more or less impact as recognition from managers? And is that also an important part of the equation?
Yeah, so definitely peers are very important. And so I showed that stat about managers being 2 times more influential than leaders or peers, but leaders and peers are still influential. So it's definitely not the case that forget everything else and managers are the only thing that matters. We see the greatest positive effects and the greatest positive organizational change when leaders, managers, and peers all enact these behaviors. That's when those organizations who do that well, we see them have the greatest benefit and have the greatest positive change.
That makes sense. And Imram asks, how much of this work was inspired by BJ Fogg's Tiny Habits book? They see a lot of parallels, but they like the automated component. And are also wondering, in addition to that, does the nudge ever become burdensome? And I'm wondering as well, do people just tune them out after some time?
Yeah, so in terms of the inspiration, absolutely. So both of these examples definitely draw heavily from nudge theory and the concept of a nudge and concept of behavioral economics. And so absolutely really closely connected there. In terms of sort of habituating, it's really important to regularly get regular data inputs so that people do not habituate to them. And so the key is that you have to design an always-on system, which is what we've designed, that can take in inputs regularly about the status of the HRIS data, about how people are feeling, about how people are interacting. Because if I found out, Stefanie needs recognition, and so my manager gets recognition nudges, and then we never changed anything ever again, absolutely we'd habituate. But the key is creating this really responsive system where organizations, fortunately and unfortunately, are really dynamic systems that change very, very regularly. And so it is never the case that an organization is the same day after day after day. And so our system takes in this data to say, what's the challenge this week or this month or this year, and then changes nudges accordingly. And so because they're changing so regularly and adapting to what are the pressing needs of the organization, then we see a lot of change. And so fortunately, that habituation is really not an issue.
And then you spoke a bit about the new managers versus more experienced managers. Joe is asking about the level of manager in the organization. So if you're head of a section or a division versus a project manager versus a team lead, so how does that factor into the importance of the manager, and then also maybe how you can best nudge them?
Yeah, so all of those managers are super important and all of them have influence. One of the interesting things that we found in our data is that people who are most engaged with nudges and people who are really sort of champions within their organization tend to be individuals who are in more of a leadership position as a manager, but maybe not in the main branch of the organization. We often see really fascinating results there. So if maybe you head a division or you're in a specific region or do a specific job type that's not the entire organization, we often see that those managers are really the hungriest for this because they're getting these directives from above, but then they say, well, my organization is totally different beneath, and I have this totally different type of worker or this totally different type of situation. And so we see real hunger from those managers in particular to say, hey, help me out, translate this to the organization because I'm in a really unique situation here. And so all managers are really important, but I would recommend particularly thinking about people who maybe are in a unique position where they're having to translate organizational strategy in a very different context than other managers throughout your organization.
Well, you've given us a lot of great tips. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.